Why this mountain road is closed every winter. The high elevation passes of the northern Sierra Range are subject to weather conditions that can bury a heavy semi-truck in minutes. Local highway department records indicate that one specific stretch of blacktop near the granite peaks has remained gated since 1988. Silas Vance was 56 years old and worked as a lead safety inspector for the Regional Department of Transportation Division. He had spent 30 years evaluating road stability, but he always felt a strange pressure in his ears near the summit. Silas arrived at the lower gate during a gray morning in November with a simple goal to check the seasonal locks. The air was thin and carried the scent of frozen stone and the metallic tang of an approaching heavy snowstorm. He drove his four-wheel drive pickup toward the restricted zone and noticed the pavement was covered in thin black ice. The first strange detail was that the road surface appeared to be steaming despite the temperature being well below the freezing point. Silas saw that the heat was coming from the center line and it was melting the ice in a perfect path. He checked the thermal sensors on his dashboard and found that the asphalt was radiating nearly 90 degrees of localized heat. Silas stopped the truck and walked to the edge of the guardrail to see if there were any underground steam pipes. The maintenance logs showed no geothermal activity in this sector, and no utility lines had been buried beneath the remote mountain road. Silas looked down the steep embankment and saw that the snow was completely gone from a circular patch of rocky earth. He assumed it was a chemical reaction from the road salt, but the smell in the air was sweet and floral. An hour later, Silas found a set of heavy equipment tracks that led away from the road and into the trees. These tracks did not match any of the department plows or the standard tread of a modern commercial or civilian vehicle. Silas followed the markings for 50 yards and found a vintage surveyor rod standing upright in the middle of the brush. The metal was polished and looked brand new despite the harsh mountain environment that usually rusted iron in a single season. Silas checked the serial number on the rod and realized it belonged to a crew that vanished in 1972. That specific team had been tasked with mapping the original route before the road was paved for the local logging industry. It was impossible for the tool to be in such perfect condition after sitting in the forest for several decades. The inspector began to feel a sense of heavy static as he held the cold metal rod in his gloved hands. He decided to return to his truck and check the archived radio logs from the year the surveyor crew went missing. Silas heard a recording of a man named Elias who was calling for a location check during a sudden whiteout storm. Elias reported that the road was turning beneath his feet and that the mountain was moving like a massive living thing. Silas felt a chill when he realized the voice on the old tape sounded remarkably clear and lacked any background wind. He looked at the rod again and noticed that it was vibrating with a low frequency that made his teeth ache. The inspector realized the road was not closed because of the snow, but because of a physical displacement of space. A third anomaly appeared when Silas looked through his binoculars and saw a man in a red jacket standing on the peak. The figure was holding a transit level and appeared to be taking measurements of the clouds that were rolling over the ridge. Silas called out to the man, but the wind swallowed his voice and the figure did not turn or acknowledge him. The man moved with a rhythmic and mechanical grace that suggested he was following a very specific set of internal instructions. Silas checked the local missing person files and found a photo of Elias wearing that exact same bright red parka jacket. When Silas looked through the lenses a second time, the peak was empty and only the gray rocks remained in view. He realized the surveyor was still finishing the job he started 50 years ago during the Great Winter Blizzard. Silas started connecting the dates of the road closures with the cycles of the lunar calendar and the mountain solar flares. He used a red pen to mark the years when the department had reported seeing ghost lights on the high summit. The sightings occurred on the exact nights when the road temperature spiked and the ice began to melt from the asphalt. This pattern suggested that the mountain road was acting as a conductor for an energy source that originated deep inside. Silas felt the ground buckle slightly beneath his boots, even though the seismic monitors in the valley remained perfectly still. He realized the asphalt was not just a road, but was a seal placed over a very thin spot in reality. Silas reached out to a retired foreman who had helped pave the mountain pass back in the late 60s. The foreman listened to the description of the steam, and he told Silas to leave the summit before the sun set. The old man whispered that the road was built with a special volcanic aggregate that was supposed to prevent heavy ice. He claimed the stones were taken from a site that the local tribes had warned the engineers to leave alone forever. Silas looked back at the surveyor rod and realized the notches were moving, as if the metal were slowly breathing. Every name listed in the original crew manifest was actually a descendant of the people who once protected the high peaks. Silas found a note in the foreman diary that described a road that leads to a place without time. The surveyor, Elias, was the last person to stand on the summit before the road was officially gated and locked in '88. According to the final report, Elias had discovered that the mountain was not made of solid granite, but of hollow light. Silas realized the man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was a part of the mountain itself. He received one final shock when he looked at his own GPS and saw his location was listed as sea level. The figure in the red jacket appeared at the edge of the woods and pointed toward the lower valley gate. Silas turned his truck around and drove down the mountain as fast as the black ice would allow him to. He realized that the ordinary mountain road was a bridge that only opened when the cold air hit the peak. Silas packed his gear and decided to report that the road was structurally unsound and should be decommissioned for public use. He called his supervisor to say that the granite was shifting and that the risk of a landslide was high. The supervisor accepted the report without any questions, as if he had been waiting for an excuse to keep it closed. Silas drove away and watched the summit disappear in the fog as the first heavy flakes of the storm fell. He kept the surveyor rod in his truck as a reminder of the man who was still measuring the peaks. He never spoke about the steam or the red jacket to the other inspectors or to the local media. The road remains closed every winter because the mountain needs to finish its work in the silence of the snow. The mystery of the mountain road remains a secret known only to those who have felt the heat of the asphalt. Experts say that the steam is caused by a natural underground spring that warms the rocks during the winter months. Silas knew the difference between a natural spring and a road that was trying to tell him a long story. He lived the rest of his life watching the mountains from the safety of the valley floor and the sun. The forest holds its secrets in the deep snow, and the wind covers the sound of the surveyor at work. The quiet warnings were real, and the road is still waiting for the next storm to open the door. Silas Vance died, knowing that some places on a map are not meant to be traveled by the living. The Department of Transportation eventually reinforced the gates and added a row of heavy concrete barriers to the entrance. They cited geological instability and unpredictable rockfalls as the primary reasons for the permanent closure of the northern pass. Silas often looked at his old field notes and wondered if the surveyor rod was still vibrating in the basement. He had noticed that the serial number on the rod matched the coordinates of the melting circle on the mountain. This suggested that the tools were not just instruments for measuring, but were anchors for a different kind of reality. The red jacket had become a legend among the younger rangers who claimed to see flashes of color in the fog. They spoke of a man who looked through a transit at things that were not yet built in the valley. Historical archives from the county museum revealed that several other roads in the region had been closed for similar reasons. Most of these trails led to ancient quarries where the stones were supposedly restless and warm even in the dead of winter. Silas had suspected that the entire mountain range was connected by a network of energy that the road had accidentally tapped. He spent his final months writing a manuscript that explained the relationship between the blizzard and the magnetic shifting. The pages were filled with diagrams of the surveyor rods and the way they aligned with the stars above. He knew that his work would likely be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man who spent too much time alone. Yet he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had documented the pattern for the next inspector. Whenever a heavy storm approaches the valley, the residents look up at the dark silhouette of the jagged mountain range. They see the faint glow of the summit, and they know that the road is busy with the work of ghosts. The snow falls in thick blankets that cover the tracks of the man in the red jacket until spring. Silas had left instructions to have his ashes scattered at the base of the ridge near the lower gate. He wanted to be part of the mountain that he had spent so many years trying to understand and map. The road is just a line on a map, but it is also a boundary between the known and the unknown. The gates remain locked, but the measurements continue every single time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The mountain is alive and it is still waiting for the survey to be finished by the man in red. In this new story, a forgotten winter incident recorded in an old county archive still raises questions about a lake house found half frozen during a historic storm. Investigators who later revisited the file admitted that several details continued to unsettle them despite careful reviews and steady cross-checks. Ryland Keats was 36 and worked as a custom woodworker who often stayed near remote lakes to sketch designs when his schedule finally slowed. He planned a quiet weekend away from clients and rented a small lake house managed by an older couple who lived several miles down the shoreline. The couple noted that Ryland seemed calm and said he hoped to enjoy a frozen lakeside walk before snow deepened across the region later that night. He arrived at the house before dusk and placed his sketch bag near a window overlooking the lake, which reflected sheets of early forming ice. Weather alerts shifted rapidly that evening when meteorologists warned of air pressure collapse across the county, which could generate dangerous gusts. Ryland attempted a brief walk along the frozen shoreline, but turned back quickly after hearing loud cracks traveling beneath the surface of the ice. He contacted the property owners by radio to say he would stay inside until daylight because the temperature had dropped faster than expected. The owners logged the call and mentioned that previous storms once caused strange echo patterns across the lake due to the ice reacting to pressure. The incident began when the owners attempted a routine check later that night and received only faint static along with short metallic pulses. A ranger named Mallory Sabin was on patrol nearby and overheard clipped transmissions that sounded like someone speaking under severe interference. She tried raising Ryland twice, but his signal dissolved quickly, so she drove her snow-capable truck toward the lake house despite worsening visibility. She later reported that gusts pushed ice fragments across the road and forced her to stop several times as shifting snow erased tire tracks ahead. Mallory reached the house after dark and noticed an unusual blue glow flickering through the frosted window, which resembled a lantern struggling. She knocked and called Ryland's name because property records confirmed he was the only guest staying at the lake house that weekend. There was no response, so she tried the door, which opened without resistance, even though the hinges were nearly frozen from the rising storm. Inside, she saw Ryland's jacket on a chair and his sketchbook open on the table, displaying a half-drawn shoreline image that stopped abruptly. The lantern on the counter flickered strangely while Mallory inspected the room and attempted to understand the heavy quiet that filled the house. She called for Ryland again and moved carefully across the floor because thin frost had formed on the boards near the back door earlier that evening. A mug of cooling coffee sat beside a scattered pencil set, and a single boot lay near the hallway, which suggested hurried movement. Deputies later observed that the back door showed a narrow ice seam along its edge, which indicated it had been opened briefly during freezing gusts. Two deputies arrived and began searching the lakeside in slow expanding arcs, though their lights struggled to cut through drifting powder. They found footprints near the back porch that led toward the frozen lake, but the trail vanished where the wind had swept the surface clean. Deputies noted the prints were uneven, as if Ryland had changed direction suddenly or slipped where ice formed ridges under the fresh snow. They attempted to follow the faint path, but retreated when loud groans echoed across the lake, suggesting unstable ice beneath their weight. Inside the house, investigators documented scattered belongings, which indicated Ryland had started packing before stepping outside unexpectedly. His phone rested near the lantern with a cracked screen and displayed a half-written message that ended mid-sentence during interference. The message referenced a deep thud outside, which he believed came from shifting lake ice reacting to sudden changes in temperature. But investigators discovered no crater or collapse in the ice near the house, which forced them to question whether the sound had originated elsewhere. Environmental sensors around the lake recorded a brief pressure dip during the same time Ryland drafted the message, though the cause was unclear. Experts explained that lakes sometimes emit strong acoustic shocks when rapid temperature changes cause layers of ice to buckle under tension. However, a house inspection revealed a warped floorboard near the back entry, which did not match typical swelling caused by cold exposure. Deputies examining the interior walls found frost patterns shaped in long vertical lines, which suggested a sudden airflow surge inside the house. At sunrise, search teams returned to the frozen lake, where visibility allowed them to identify old guide stakes placed along a historic walking route. One stake near a small inlet leaned at an unnatural angle, and beneath it they found a torn scrap from the lining of Ryland's missing glove. The scrap was lightly frozen to the ice, which implied it had been exposed only briefly before overnight snowfall covered the lake. This discovery directed teams toward a series of narrow cracks that extended from the inlet into deeper sections of the frozen water. A volunteer team followed the cracks carefully and located a shallow indentation where someone had slid or fallen based on surface scratches. They also found a small hand radio half buried in frost near a break in the ice, which matched the registration number assigned to the lake house. The radio showed deep scratches and a bent antenna, which indicated hard impact likely caused during a fall rather than intentional use. Divers later searched beneath the break, but limited visibility and shifting ice prevented a thorough inspection of deeper sections of the lake. Investigators theorized that Ryland stepped outside after hearing the deep thud he referenced and attempted to determine whether the ice was shifting. They believed he approached the lake's edge during a temporary lull and misjudged distance because whiteout bands obscured the shoreline. He likely slipped along an ice ridge and slid toward the inlet, where the surface cracked under his weight during the most intense winds. Teams expanded their search radius for another day, but new fractures formed across the lake, forcing them to halt operations for safety. Weeks later, audio technicians revisited Ryland's final radio attempts and isolated a strange harmonic resonance behind his voice. The tone resembled a layered echo that did not match typical interference caused by weather patterns over frozen lakes. One analyst suggested the sound might have come from stressed ice plates striking each other in rapid succession, though he admitted the timing felt off. Another believed the resonance resembled an underwater pressure fluctuation, though no equipment existed at the lake to confirm such activity. Investigators continued reviewing notes from the house, including frost lines, warped boards, and unexplained temperature fluctuations. Some experts proposed that a rapid pressure burst through the inlet could have forced cold air into the house, creating vertical frost streaks. Others argued that the warped floorboard suggested localized vibration strong enough to disrupt the house structure briefly during the storm. None of the theories fit perfectly with sensor records, which remained inconsistent during peak storm period due to equipment failures. Later interviews with previous winter visitors revealed that strange acoustic booms occasionally echoed across the lake during sudden freezes. Several described moments when ice plates shifted and sent sharp pressure waves toward the shoreline, though none mentioned structural effects. One visitor recalled the lantern inside the lake house flickering violently during a past storm, which matched what Mallory observed on arrival. These accounts supported the idea of unique lake conditions, but still failed to explain the floor distortion found during the investigation. A geological survey conducted months later identified several deep fissures beneath the frozen lake caused by long-term structural changes underwater. Surveyors suggested that rare pressure events might occur when unstable ice layers collapsed under shifting weight during extreme cold snaps. They believed such pressure bursts could generate the sounds Ryland heard, though they emphasized that events strong enough to deform a building were unusual. This theory aligned with some evidence, but still left major questions unanswered, especially regarding the warped floor and sudden airflow patterns. Despite extensive efforts, investigators agreed that Ryland most likely slipped into the frozen inlet after approaching the lake during unstable conditions. Whiteout gusts combined with shifting ice would have created disorientation and masked dangerous sections where cracks formed beneath accumulating snow. However, the unusual frost patterns inside the house and the warped floorboard continued to unsettle specialists who studied the case years later. These anomalies appeared in the final report, which labeled the precise trigger for Ryland's exit as unresolved due to conflicting evidence. Seasonal crews installed warning signs along the inlet, urging winter visitors to avoid the frozen lake during rapid temperature shifts. The lake house owners updated their safety guidelines, advising guests to stay indoors during sharp pressure changes detected by regional sensors. Training programs across the county referenced the case to demonstrate the sudden hazards associated with frozen lakes during severe storms. Yet the puzzle of Ryland's final moments remained open for debate among investigators who believed key atmospheric details were still missing. Experts who revisit the file today agree that the case endures not because of impossible theories, but because of small, unexplained contradictions. The harmonic audio resonance, the warped floorboard, and the frost lines inside the lake house each resist simple interpretation. Most investigators conclude that Ryland likely suffered an accidental fall while attempting to understand the deep thud he heard outside that evening. The case endures in local memory as a haunting reminder that frozen lakes can hide unpredictable forces capable of overwhelming even careful visitors. In this new story, archived Winter Patrol summaries describe a remote ski lodge where several visitors reportedly vanished during January storms across multiple decades. Officials never confirmed foul play, which left the lodge classified as a low-priority site despite the strange overlap in dates. Old regional bulletins noted that each disappearance occurred within days of the first heavy snowfall, which created a pattern difficult to ignore. Ronan Kessler, a 36-year-old field technician, received a routine task on a freezing morning when his supervisor asked him to inspect abandoned power lines near that ridge. The request surprised him because the site had not appeared on maintenance schedules for years. He prepared his truck with insulated gear, his weather-worn notebook, and a sturdy radio known to survive interference. The early sky looked pale and washed out, which usually signaled an incoming storm building behind the mountains. He drove up the single-lane access road, which climbed steadily until trees vanished behind blankets of white. Drifts covered the route, which forced him to stop several times to clear ice near the wheel wells. When he reached the last turn, he saw the lodge looming through shifting snow. The structure looked crooked from years of neglect, yet fresh footprints led directly to the warped front door. That detail unsettled him because archives mentioned no active crews assigned to the lodge during winter. Ronan stepped out while the wind whipped icy flakes across the ridge. He approached the entrance slowly since the wooden deck creaked under his boots. A rusted metal sign hung sideways above the door while strands of caution tape fluttered against a railing. The smell of cold pine mixed with a faint chemical scent that reminded him of old industrial labs. He hesitated before pushing open the door, which groaned loudly under layers of ice. Inside, he found a lobby coated in dust and frost. Faded ski posters sagged from the walls, and a collapsed rental counter leaned at an awkward angle. The chemical odor strengthened, which made him breathe shallowly through his scarf. He stood still to listen for movement because abandoned structures often held unexpected hazards. The silence felt oppressive and heavy, like the lodge was absorbing sounds rather than echoing them. A sudden metallic clash rang from a far corridor, which made him tighten his grip on the flashlight. Snow blew through a cracked window, adding a restless whisper to the emptiness. He said quietly, "Hello," while hoping to flush out any squatters. No answer came, which increased his concern. He walked toward the noise with careful steps, because uneven floors hid under piles of broken plaster. Halfway down the corridor, he found a steel grate leaning against the wall. Its weight and finish did not match the lodge design, which suggested someone installed it recently. Behind it, he saw a narrow maintenance stairwell missing from old blueprints. He documented the discovery with several photos, then stepped back because the chemical smell grew overwhelming near the stairwell opening. Steam-like condensation rose upward, which felt too warm for an abandoned building in deep winter. Ronan returned to the main corridor and entered a storage room where the door hung crooked on a single hinge. A tripod stood in the center of the room with a camera aimed at a roughly cut hole in the wall. Dust covered everything except the lens, which shone clean in his flashlight beam. The battery compartment sat empty, which suggested deliberate removal. He wrote a quick note in his book about the setup because the arrangement looked designed rather than accidental. A heavy thump sounded from the upper floor, which shook loose frost from exposed rafters. Ronan flinched, then steadied himself before climbing the staircase. The wooden steps bowed under his weight, which forced him to test each board before moving forward. On the landing, he discovered rooms stripped nearly to their frames. One room held several winter jackets arranged neatly along a wall. The jackets looked too new for the lodge and showed no signs of mold, which indicated they had not been here long. He checked a tag that matched a model released only a few years earlier. Near a toppled dresser, he found an emergency service patch tucked between floorboards. The fabric looked clean, which meant someone had dropped it recently. He placed it inside an evidence envelope because the detail felt too important to ignore. Outside the window, he saw the storm intensify until the sky turned white. Snowfall thickened to the point that distant tree lines disappeared. Ronan followed smaller footprints leading toward the lounge where skylight glass had collapsed into hardened ice. The prints cut through drifts before stopping at a kitchen door. He opened it and found a metal table dragged across the floor, leaving long scrape marks. Beneath the table, a wooden hatch stood open, which revealed a stairwell carved into darkness. The chemical smell rushed outward with surprising force, which made him recoil. A faint cough drifted up from the stairwell, which made him freeze. He whispered, "I hear you," and waited. A weak voice answered with a strained plea for help. He descended cautiously because unstable structures could collapse unexpectedly. At the bottom, he found a basement lined with insulation sheets arranged almost like padding. Several portable heaters stood unplugged yet positioned in a deliberate pattern. A pulley system hung overhead with ropes stretched tightly across beams. Behind a crate, he found a woman in her early 20s slumped against the wall with frostbitten fingers and a torn parka. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain what happened. She and a friend entered the lodge 2 days earlier when they were caught in a sudden storm. They heard machinery deeper inside and approached it, believing it might lead to shelter. She remembered stepping on a section of floor that dropped suddenly, which sent her falling into the basement while her friend tried to pull her up. She lost consciousness shortly afterward. Ronan checked her pulse, which felt weak yet steady. He guided her to sit upright against a crate, then searched for signs of the missing friend. Near the pulley system, he found boot impressions similar to the prints upstairs. Scratch marks lined a wooden frame that hid a recessed pressure plate. Someone had tried to pry open the frame using a flat tool. He moved the frame aside with effort, which revealed the plate covered in dust except for a single clean fingerprint. When he pressed the plate lightly, a loud click came from the ceiling, which sounded like a mechanical trigger resetting. He realized the lodge had been altered with a system of hidden traps that responded to pressure changes and weight distribution. The craftsmanship required knowledge beyond casual tinkering. Someone built these modifications intentionally and likely over several winters. A sudden crack from above signaled the hatch beginning to close under its own power. Ronan grabbed the woman and hurried up the stairs as the door slammed shut behind them. The echo vibrated through the corridor, which reminded him of controlled mechanisms, not typical decay. They entered the kitchen where the room groaned under storm pressure. The wind roared through broken vents, which matched the earlier warm draft rising from the stairwell. In the lobby, he noticed the steel grate along the hallway beginning to slide across the floor. The movement looked unnatural because no visible motor powered it. He rushed forward while supporting the woman and jammed a fallen ski pole under the grate, which slowed its closing. They slipped past into the snow as the grate clanged shut behind them with finality. Outside, the storm battered them with bursts of icy wind. Ronan wrapped her in a heavy blanket and secured her in the truck before starting the engine. The wheels spun until they caught traction along the icy path. The descent took hours, while visibility dropped to almost nothing. The constant drum of sleet against the windshield nearly drowned out the woman's occasional murmurs. They reached a ranger station before midnight, where medics treated her for exposure. She offered fragmented details about clicking noises and shifting floors. Investigators interviewed her over several days, though her memory blurred around the moment the floor collapsed. She insisted she heard breathing near the walls during the hours before she fell. When authorities reached the lodge several days later, they found much of the mechanical system dismantled. The pulley framework remained, though the ropes were cut and several gears removed. Inspectors noted inconsistent footprints around the stairwell, suggesting someone visited after Ronan escaped. The jackets in the upper room had vanished, and the tripod camera was gone, along with the clean lens. Ronan accompanied a second team to verify details in his original report. The lodge interior looked different from his earlier visit, which unsettled him. Several rooms had collapsed ceilings that were intact days before. Marks on the floor that once indicated mechanical movement now appeared faint or replaced with scattered debris. Only the pressure plate remained unchanged, though it now sat covered with a fine layer of frost. Later analysis of regional utility files uncovered an unregistered service request from a contractor using a false company name. The request dated back many winters and mentioned delivery of specialized metal components to a site matching the lodge's coordinates. Investigators never traced the contractor despite repeated attempts. During a follow-up search, rangers found an old sled buried under several feet of snow behind the building. The sled carried fragments of rope identical to fibers in the basement pulley system. They also discovered a rusted metal frame with adjustable weights similar to early counterbalance prototypes used in training facilities many decades earlier. Ronan provided additional notes describing temperature shifts he felt inside the lodge, which suggested hidden vents still operated despite no visible power source. Technicians checked for backup generators but found none. They concluded that stored mechanical energy might have powered some of the systems, though no clear explanation emerged. The missing hiker eventually recovered enough to share more details. They remembered hearing rhythmic knocking sounds shortly before becoming separated. They believed the sound came from within the walls, though investigators could not confirm it. The hiker recalled climbing through a tight service gap before blacking out on the ridge, which explained their location when found. Local residents discussed the incident throughout the season. Some believed the lodge served as a clandestine workshop for an unknown engineer fascinated with pressure-triggered traps. Others suspected the place was used as a winter hideout by someone who did not want company. A few claimed older generations whispered about strange noises near that ridge long before the lodge existed. Ronan avoided the site after his final visit because every clue pointed toward deliberate manipulation rather than random decay. The combination of warm drafts, shifting floors, and automated grates suggested a creator who still visited during heavy storms. He often replayed the moment the grate moved by itself, which convinced him the system remained active even after partial dismantling. Authorities secured the area with new barriers and updated warnings. The lodge still stands, buried under January snow. Windows rattle during storms, which gives the building a faint pulse, like a living thing adjusting to winter pressure. Those who approach claim the lodge feels watchful. The basement stairwell remains the most disturbing feature because even sealed doors cannot hide the subtle warmth drifting upward long after all mechanisms supposedly stopped. Ronan believes someone mastered the rhythm of storms and used the lodge to test ideas during the quietest nights. The deeper truth remains locked within those walls, where sound, machinery, and winter silence blend into something quietly waiting for the next January visitor who wanders too close to a place that never fully lets go of its secrets. In this new story, archived winter investigation files from 3 different counties describe a particular stretch of mountain highway where whiteouts reportedly form faster than radio towers can update alerts. The phenomenon repeats every December. It isn't marked on public maps, authorities never officially classify it as hazardous, yet everyone living within 50 miles knows exactly which section it is. Locals simply call it the Ridge, travelers call it Cursed, and truckers who use the road at night learn quickly that you cannot outrun a whiteout there because the storms behave like something alive. Lennox Rourke, a 37-year-old contracted supply driver, drove that highway on a mid-December evening under a sky that looked too still for winter. The air felt heavy rather than cold, the kind of pressure that builds before storms gather but hides long enough to trick forecasters. He finished loading equipment crates onto the bed of his truck, tightened the straps twice, then checked his chains, flare kit, first aid bag, and the battery in his handheld radio. He kept a heavy thermos of coffee beside him, a habit formed after 20 winters spent hauling supplies into the mountains. He left the last outpost before dusk, following the 2-lane highway into a narrow canyon where wind usually howled through rock cuts. That night, the canyon remained silent. Not a single gust, not a single shifting branch. He watched his breath curl in the cab and felt the strange stillness press against the windows like a held breath. Snow lingered in small flurries that drifted in lazy spirals. The clouds above the ridge formed long, undisturbed sheets that glowed faintly in the fading light. 10 miles up, he noticed a pair of fresh tire tracks on the snow-coated pavement. They belonged to a smaller vehicle, likely a compact sedan judging by the width. The tracks wobbled toward the outer shoulder several times before correcting. Whoever drove ahead wasn't confident on the ice. Lennox radioed a routine position update, received static instead of a response, and slowed his speed as he approached a long curve that overlooked a steep ravine. Through his headlights, he saw the parked sedan. Its hazard lights blinked weakly. Snow piled against the bumper. The driver door hung open. He pulled behind it and stepped out into a sudden gust that didn't match the earlier calm. Snow stung his cheeks. The seat inside the sedan held a thin layer of frost, as if the driver abandoned it recently. A half-written note lay on the passenger floor. It described disorientation, a strange pulsing glare over the ridge, and worsening visibility ahead. The scrawled handwriting ended mid-sentence in a long, jagged mark. Footprints led into the dense timberline, then vanished abruptly where the wind swept through the trees. Lennox called out, but only swirling snow answered. He checked the trunk and glove compartment, confirming no luggage or wallet remained. It looked like the driver fled in a panic. He radioed dispatch again, but the signal cut in and out, the interference sharp and pulsing in sync with unseen static. He continued up the highway because the research lodge needed its supplies before temperatures dropped overnight. Snow deepened quickly. He flicked on the high beams and leaned forward as he climbed another 1,000 feet of elevation. The wind returned with sudden force, carrying sheets of white across the pavement. The whiteout formed instantly. In less than a second, his world turned to blinding white. His beams reflected back into his cab like a wall of light. The road disappeared beneath swirling frost. He slowed to a crawl, searching for the faint yellow line beneath the snow. The truck groaned as the wind shoved at its side. Then he felt it, a deep, rolling vibration beneath the pavement. It rumbled through the steering column and into his arms. At first, he thought he drove over cracked asphalt, but the vibration repeated in a pattern far too regular to be natural. It felt like machinery working under the road, pulsing in slow waves. A hollow hum filled the cab, not a noise from the engine, but something distant traveling through the ground. He gripped the wheel tighter and whispered to himself that he only needed to reach the next turnout. But the storm had erased every landmark. His radio crackled violently before going silent. Even emergency frequencies fell into total static. Through the swirling white, he saw a faint glow, dim and warm like a lantern or flare. It pulsed twice, then faded. The storm swallowed it whole. He finally spotted the turnout sign half buried under wind-shaped drifts. He turned into it and killed the engine. The moment the truck stilled, the world fell silent, except for the soft hiss of snow against the windows. The vibration beneath the ground returned, stronger this time. He stepped out and instantly felt the storm slam him sideways. Snow whipped across his vision in chaotic bursts. Still, he saw it again, the distant lantern-like glow flickering far down the ridge, swaying as if carried by an unsteady hand. He raised his flashlight and followed the glow. Each step sank past his ankles. The wind roared so loudly he barely heard his breathing. The lantern glow brightened, then dimmed. When he reached the ridge edge, the wind paused, just briefly, revealing a trail of fresh footprints descending into a narrow gap between two boulders. He followed the prints to a sheltered clearing, where the wind died completely. There, he found a metal service box half buried in ice. Its door hung open, clinking softly in the breeze. Inside, a flickering emergency lamp illuminated piles of old engineering logs scattered across the snow. He brushed frost off one page and read that decades ago, crews tried stabilizing the ridge after discovering deep fractures extending several miles beneath the highway. Some fractures reportedly produced heavy vibrations during cold snaps, others echoed with humming noises long after construction equipment shut down. One engineer wrote that whiteouts triggered surface shifts powerful enough to knock tools off tables. Another recorded flashes of color during storms that turned the snow blue for a moment before fading. None of the entries ended optimistically. The project halted after a series of unexplained injuries. The final pages contained abrupt, shaky handwriting as if recorded in haste before crews evacuated the area. The wind returned violently, slamming the service box door against its hinge. Snow blasted across the clearing, burying the footprints behind Lennox in seconds. He attempted to climb back to the turnout, but the storm collapsed around him. The whiteout erased all shape, all direction, all sense of slope. The vibration beneath the ground grew into a steady pulse. He dropped one knee into the drift, bracing himself. Then the light appeared again, this time brighter, bluish, and closer. It flashed once, then again. It illuminated the storm like lightning flickering inside a closed room. He shielded his face as the vibration stopped abruptly, leaving a deep ringing in his ears. When the storm eased momentarily, he recognized the outline of his truck barely 30 yards uphill. He pushed through the drifts and climbed into the cab with shaking hands. His headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. And then something struck the back of the truck. Not a rock, not debris, something heavy enough to shift the entire chassis. He looked through the rear window but saw only churning white. When the dash lights returned, he noticed new tracks behind his vehicle footprints moving in a staggering, uneven pattern. They circled the back of the truck twice before stopping abruptly at an untouched drift. No exit trail. No continuation. Just sudden absence. The radio crackled violently. A voice broke through for half a second, a woman screaming a word he couldn't understand. The signal collapsed again before the dispatcher came through, faintly asking for his status. Lennox forced his voice steady as he reported everything he'd seen. She ordered him to return immediately. The descent felt endless. Whiteout pockets still erupted at random, swallowing the world in sudden blindness before releasing it again. Snow reflected his taillights in ghostly red bursts. The mountain behind him pulsed with silent flashes he could not explain. Only when he reached the lower forest line did the storm finally weaken. Search teams reached the abandoned sedan the next morning. The seat still held a thin layer of frost. The driver never returned. No prints remained except deep indentations captured in early photographs. A team located the service box clearing and retrieved the logs, confirming chronic seismic anomalies beneath that stretch of highway. Several log entries matched the timing of Lennox's report almost exactly. But the most disturbing discovery came from the audio files engineers recovered from Lennox's malfunctioning radio. Buried beneath the static, analysts detected irregular pulses matching the tremor pattern of underground shifts too deep and too rhythmic to be caused by ordinary geological movement. Locals still warn travelers never to trust the ridge's calm skies. They say the whiteouts there do not behave like normal storms. They arrive instantly. They vanish instantly. And sometimes, during the brightest flashes, they reveal silhouettes of things standing where no person could stand. Some claim to hear humming beneath the tires just before the visibility collapses. Others swear the snow glows blue right before the tremors begin. Lennox refuses to drive that highway now. He told investigators he can still feel the vibration in his bones when he thinks about the storm. And he still dreams about the footprints appearing behind his truck, circling twice before ending nowhere, as if something walked there only long enough to watch him through the snow. He knows one thing for certain. On that mountain highway, you cannot outrun a whiteout. Not because it moves fast, but because it feels like the storm is already waiting for you the moment you decide to climb the ridge. And once the wind closes, there is no direction, only white, only echoes, and only the sense that something beneath the road finally woke up. In this new story, archived winter maintenance logs mention an old steel bridge on a remote state route where severe icing and unexplained stallouts reportedly occur each year. Officials list the bridge as structurally sound, yet the pattern repeats every December and January. Locals warn travelers to avoid crossing it after dark because storms form quickly along the river valley, and visibility often collapses without warning. Several incidents ended with vehicles found empty. engines still warm, doors locked or left swinging open in icy wind. Marin Calloway, a 34-year-old environmental field sampler, approached that bridge during an early January afternoon while returning from a downstream water quality site. She expected a routine drive since snowfall remained light and her schedule only required one more sample reading before she reached town. She drove a sturdy four-wheel truck with insulated gear, a portable radio, and laminated route maps. Even with preparation, she disliked that bridge because the steel trusses groaned in cold weather and the deck froze faster than surrounding pavement. The sky carried a muted gray color as she climbed the winding route toward the river valley. Tall pines leaned inward across the shoulder, while thin clouds dragged along the ridgetops. The temperature dropped several degrees as she descended toward the bridge. Ahead, she noticed faint tire tracks veering near the guardrail before straightening again. She slowed instinctively since the state's winter bulletin mentioned 2 minor spinouts in the area earlier that week. When she reached the approach, she saw an empty sedan parked crookedly near the midpoint. Its hazard lights blinked steadily through drifting snow. She pulled over before stepping out to check for the driver. A strong crosswind pushed at her coat, while the steel beams above her produced a low groan. The sedan's driver door stood slightly ajar, yet no footprints led away from it. Snow should have covered them quickly, but even shallow indentations would remain visible under the slow-falling flakes. She called hello several times, but heard nothing except the river rumbling below under layers of ice. She checked the sedan interior where the key remained in the ignition, and the dashboard still glowed faintly. A small notebook lay open on the passenger seat, with scribbles mentioning a vibration felt halfway across the span. The writing ended abruptly near the words freezing up. The pages showed no signs of wet snow, which meant the driver likely wrote it minutes before abandoning the car. Marin recorded the license plate and noted the coordinates before heading back to her truck. The wind intensified as she approached the midpoint of the bridge. The steel trusses groaned a second time with a deeper tone. She slowed to listen and felt a faint vibration travel through the pavement into her boots. She stepped toward the guardrail and leaned over. Chunks of ice floated beneath winding currents, but the water remained mostly frozen. The vibration pulsed again like something thudding far beneath the surface. She stepped back toward her truck while the wind grew harsher. Marin radioed dispatch to report the abandoned vehicle, but the signal crackled heavily. Static filled the line, followed by fragmented syllables. She repeated her message and received no clear reply. Storm fronts often disrupted valley reception, yet this distortion sounded more mechanical than atmospheric. She logged the attempted call and returned to her truck, intending to cross quickly before conditions worsened. Halfway across, she felt the steering wheel jitter lightly. The vibration returned through the frame. Snow blew in shifting curtains that obscured her view of the opposite shore. The vibration grew into a steady thrum, not strong enough to shake the truck, yet impossible to ignore. She slowed to a crawl. Her headlights cut through swirling flakes and revealed a faint glow near the far guardrail. The glow flickered, dimmed, then grew slightly brighter. She braked softly and leaned forward. The glow seemed to originate near the deck surface. She stepped out of the truck cautiously while keeping the door open. The wind cut at her cheeks. She approached the guardrail and shone her flashlight downward. The beam reflected against thick ice, but a faint shimmering line pulsed beneath the surface. It moved slowly, traveling parallel to the bridge, as if following the riverbed. The pulse dimmed, then strengthened again. Marin backed away quickly. The vibration synced with the shimmering pulse, which made the steel beneath her boots tremble faintly. She reached for her truck door when a deep crack echoed from underneath the structure. The sound reverberated through the trusses like metal bending under pressure. She froze for 2 seconds before climbing back into the truck and slamming the door. She pressed the accelerator gently. The wheels spun on ice before gripping. Snow intensified into a sudden, dense sheet that reduced visibility to almost nothing. She kept her truck centered on the faint raised reflectors along the deck until she reached the opposite end. As she climbed uphill toward the turnout beyond the bridge, she noticed a shape standing near the maintenance shed. Her headlights flashed across the figure, which appeared motionless, bundled in heavy winter gear. She slowed and rolled down her window slightly. "Do you need help?" she called. The figure did not respond. When her headlights angled downward during the next dip in the road, she realized the figure was actually an empty parka mounted on a bent steel pole. The wind pushed the parka slightly, which made it appear as if it shifted earlier. A tag pinned to the collar read, "Watch the ice line." She had never seen maintenance crews mark hazards this way. She parked near the shed and inspected the pole. The snow around it showed old indentations, but no recent footprints. Inside the shed, she found an outdated maintenance log containing entries from more than a decade earlier. One page mentioned crews hearing low-frequency tremors during extreme cold spells. Another described sudden frost forming inside the shed even when heaters ran. Toward the end of the log, a note stated that bright pulses appeared beneath the ice during storms, yet no cracks were found in the bridge's support piers. The final entry ended with a reference to ice lines shifting upstream anytime temperatures dropped sharply. Wind slammed the shed door and extinguished her flashlight for a moment. She stepped outside but found the air unnervingly still. Snowflakes drifted downward in silence. The river should have produced noise, yet for a few seconds everything felt muted. A faint clicking sound broke the stillness. It came from the underside of the bridge, a slow metallic pattern repeated 3 times before fading. Marin radioed dispatch again from the turnout. This time, the signal passed through cleanly. She reported the abandoned sedan and unusual vibrations. The operator confirmed they already received partial reports of a missing driver earlier that afternoon. A unit would arrive within an hour, but warned her not to return to the bridge until the storm weakened. She waited in her truck until wind pressure shifted enough to force snow sideways. She watched the bridge through the windshield. The shimmering pulse beneath the ice appeared again, brighter this time. It ran along the length of the river as if moving upstream. The steel trusses shivered lightly, which made her grip the steering wheel unconsciously. She could not tell whether the vibration came from the ice or the structure itself. When the rescue unit finally reached the area, they located the sedan, but found no tracks leading away from it. They reported the same vibration and noted that sections of the ice beneath the span reflected their searchlights strangely. Marin gave them her notes and continued toward town with caution. Snow thickened again behind her as she drove along the ridge overlooking the river. Authorities inspected the bridge thoroughly the next day. They found no structural damage, no cracked piers, and no mechanical cause for the vibration. They confirmed mild seismic activity occurred during the storm, but classified it as normal for deep winter temperature shifts. The missing driver's notebook remained the only clue, though no one could explain the abrupt ending in the final entry. Engineers attempted to recreate the shimmering pulse by shining lights beneath the ice during later inspections, but found nothing. Local fishermen, however, claimed to see faint lines of light drifting under certain stretches of the frozen river during extreme cold. Some believed trapped algae layers caused the effect. Others said the riverbed housed decades-old drainage conduits that funneled air pockets in odd patterns. None of these explanations matched the rhythmic vibration reported for years. Residents warned travelers again as January progressed. They said the bridge changed personality during deep freezes. Cars stalled inexplicably, even with full fuel tanks. People heard tapping beneath the deck when wind pressure increased. Sometimes faint footprints appeared on the bridge at dawn, despite fresh, untouched snow before and after the prints. Marin avoided the route for weeks after her encounter. She later reviewed the maintenance log she photographed at the shed and noticed a line she missed earlier. One entry mentioned that ice shifted as if pulled from beneath the river during certain nights. The writer also noted that steel beams resonated like tuning forks when the pulses passed under the span. Each winter, the same phenomena return. Drivers report sudden fog banks forming above the deck. Some describe a faint glow beneath the ice moving against the current. Others mention headlights flickering when crossing the midpoint. No conclusive evidence explains the cause. Yet every January, the maintenance crew marks the bridge with new salt barrels, fresh cones, and handwritten warnings on orange boards. As temperatures drop and storms rebuild across the mountains, the frozen bridge begins to groan again. The vibration returns in slow, deliberate waves. And travelers crossing at night sometimes swear they feel the entire river shift beneath them, as if something deep below follows the lines of ice, waiting for the coldest moment to rise toward the surface. The warning, hidden in a camper's last dashcam footage. The presence of a dashcam often provides the only objective record of what occurs when a person disappears into the wilderness alone. In many cases of missing hikers and campers, the final frames of footage contain subtle details that authorities originally missed during the initial search. A small silver vehicle was found abandoned at the end of a Forest Service road in the spring of 2022. Inside the car, a dashboard camera was still plugged into the power port, despite the battery of the vehicle being completely dead. Lyle Hendricks was a 48-year-old freelance photographer who specialized in capturing rare nocturnal wildlife in the high desert. He arrived at the remote canyon entrance on a Friday afternoon with the simple goal of setting up his motion cameras. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and Lyle expected to stay at his campsite for at least 3 nights. He carried a professional-grade camera bag and enough water to last for several days in the dry heat of the canyon. The landscape was rugged and filled with deep sandstone cracks that could easily hide a man from the view of a helicopter. As Lyle drove his truck along the narrow dirt path, he noticed a series of strange markings painted on the rocks. He followed the winding road until he reached a flat clearing where the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. The dashcam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect the area before the sun began to set. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the brush near the base of the cliffs. He returned to the truck and checked his GPS unit before realizing that the signal was fluctuating wildly for no reason. He sat in the driver's seat and the dashcam captured a strange humming sound that seemed to be coming from the ground. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind that day. Lyle reached for his radio to call the park dispatch office, but only static came through the small speakers of the unit. He found a piece of notebook paper and wrote a quick note about a light he saw reflecting off the canyon walls. The handwriting on the note was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle parked had been the site of several unexplained disappearances since 1975. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple campers reported seeing figures that moved without making any sound at all. Search teams arrived at the clearing 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but found no signs of a struggle or injury. They found his camera equipment sitting on the ground, but the memory cards had been removed from every single device in his bag. Lyle picked up his dashcam and realized it was the only piece of hardware that still had a recorded file on it. The photographer had decided to keep the dashcam running through the night to capture any movement in front of his truck headlights. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the internal microphone picked up a rhythmic clicking. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the vehicle one last time to investigate the source of the noise. He walked toward the edge of the clearing and disappeared from the frame of the dashcam as the clicking sound grew louder. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working monitor and watched the final 30 minutes of the dashcam file with the volume turned up. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a metal door latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the canyon floor. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of any hiker they had seen. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn someone about a danger approaching from the hills. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the ground even when the moon was hidden behind the thick clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of geologists working in the same sector. Lyle Hendricks reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer to his car. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the clearing that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the windshield to develop a network of fine cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the undercarriage of the abandoned truck. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a strange biological mechanism. The camper whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high beam lights of the truck. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the battery to die so the clearing would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the vehicle with incredible mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Hendricks had originally concluded that he likely fell into a deep canyon crevice while hiking. However, the details on the dashcam suggested that the camper was being actively hunted by something that understood how his technology worked. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped recording at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of a person. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the metal frame of the heavy silver truck. The final few seconds of the video contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the lens from the outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the surrounding air. He mentioned that he was going to try and run toward the cave system he had photographed earlier that same day. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the car alarm being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black, without any more images of the canyon or Lyle. The sheriff contacted the Forest Service the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage of the camera. A technician named Silas Vance examined the digital files and confirmed that the footage had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the clearing together to look for the cave system Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the sand that contained a series of sketches and a broken lens. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged canyon floor. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of a cave with glowing patterns etched into its gray, translucent skin. Silas noted that the broken lens had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Hendricks had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been here since 1900. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the dashcam footage remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Hendricks often thinks about the quiet photographer and the warning he tried to leave behind for others. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who carry cameras. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The clearing remains empty and avoided by locals, but the dashcam still holds the final warning of 2022. The secret behind an unmarked highway pull-off. The existence of unmarked highway pull-offs often suggests a forgotten history or a utility access point that the public was never meant to use. A local road maintenance crew found a hidden gravel path tucked behind a dense row of overgrown hedges near the interstate exit last spring. The entrance was intentionally obscured by heavy timber and a rusted gate that appeared to have been locked for over 40 years without being disturbed. It led to a small concrete bunker that sat perfectly level with the surrounding forest floor and was completely invisible from the main road above. Silas Vance was a 38-year-old civil engineer who spent his career inspecting the structural integrity of old mountain infrastructure. He arrived at the highway mile marker early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of assessing the drainage pipes for the county. The weather was unusually humid for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his survey before the heavy afternoon rain began to fall. He carried a professional surveying kit and a high-powered flashlight to navigate the dark and damp spaces beneath the elevated roadway. The forest was thick, and the air felt heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and ancient limestone dust that never quite settled. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of blackberry brambles, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a heavy steel chain. He followed the path of the rusted metal until he saw the silhouette of a heavy iron door set into the side of a hill. The frame was reinforced with thick concrete, and the handle was seized shut by decades of exposure to the mountain moisture and cold. Silas stepped onto the concrete pad and felt the ground vibrate slightly as a heavy truck passed on the highway high above his head. He noticed that the seal around the door was still airtight and the industrial paint had not chipped despite the passage of time. He pushed the door with all his weight and noticed a strange scent of ozone and hydraulic fluid hanging heavy in the air inside. A thick layer of white frost covered the walls and every surface, but the control panels in the center of the room looked brand new. Silas approached the console and saw a series of analog gauges sitting ready as if someone had just finished a shift at the station. He found a small leather logbook resting beside the monitor with a handwritten label that simply said Project Deep Reach. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a person who was working under extreme mental or physical stress. According to local archives, the last technician assigned to this specific underground facility was a man named Elias Thorne in 1972. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his daily status reports without any prior warning or explanation to his superiors. Search teams combed the surrounding woods for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing government contractor or his personal vehicle. Silas picked up the logbook and realized it was the only piece of documentation left in the entire cold and silent room. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man who worked alone in the dark. The engineer decided to bring the logbook back to his field office to see if the written entries contained any clues about the facility. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon of the mountains. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to read the words of the man who had vanished so long ago from the pull-off. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for any historical context regarding the secret construction projects of the 1970s era. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement of the road. Silas eventually found a magnifying glass in his desk drawer and began to read the first entry by the light of his lamp. He turned the page and heard the sound of the wind rattling the glass of his office window as he focused on the text. A voice in his head seemed to form as he read about a series of vibrations appearing in the lower bedrock of the valley. The man in the logbook claimed that the vibrations were moving in patterns that did not match any known seismic activity or mining work. He wrote with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced geologist who was familiar with the deep crust of the earth. The narrator described how the vibrations would intensify for hours before disappearing into the deep aquifers that ran beneath the local mountain range. Witness statements from 1972 mention similar low-frequency noises being heard by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the ventilation shafts of the secret underground station. He believed that something was moving through the limestone tunnels and was using the highway pull-off to monitor the traffic on the surface. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass lenses of his glasses to vibrate and eventually crack in his hands. Silas read closely as the logbook captured the description of rhythmic thumping against the exterior concrete walls of the hidden mountain bunker. Elias stopped writing for several hours, and the next entry was a frantic scrawl that was barely legible to the human eye. The technician whispered through his writing that he could see shadows moving through the reinforced glass of the observation port in the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from any government agency, and they did not look like any human beings he had ever encountered. The thumping was persistent and moved from the floors up to the heavy steel ceiling of the room with a terrifying speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from a mental breakdown and walked into the woods. However, the details in the logbook suggested that the technician was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his life and safety. Silas paused his reading and looked at the date on the final page, which was the night before Elias went missing from his post. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the description of the thumping in the logbook matched the vibration he felt. The sound was sharp and sounded like heavy stones striking against the reinforced concrete frame of the isolated highway station. The final few paragraphs of the logbook contained a frantic description of the bunker being filled with a bright and blinding green light. Elias shouted through his pen that the humming sound was vibrating his teeth and making his eyes lose focus from the sheer pressure. He mentioned that he was going to bolt the inner chamber and hoped that the mountain would protect him from the entities outside. The writing ended abruptly with a long ink smear across the page and the sound of a heavy metallic crash recorded in his memory. Silence filled the office of Silas as he closed the book and looked out at the dark and empty highway in the distance. Silas contacted the state historical department the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned highway pull-off site. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the logbook and confirmed that the ink and paper matched the official government supplies of 1972. They returned to the site of the bunker together to look for the inner chamber Elias mentioned in the final pages of his log. The woods seemed different under the gray morning light, but the feeling of being watched by something unseen remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal door buried behind a stack of rusted supply crates that contained a series of blueprints and a gold watch. The blueprints showed detailed diagrams of a tunnel system that extended several miles beneath the highway and into the center of the mountain. One image captured a large circular chamber that was not part of the original engineering plans for the highway pull-off or the bunker. Marcus noted that the gold watch had stopped at the exact moment the final log entry was written during that night in August. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply walked away, but had been pulled into a world that existed far below the surface. The hands on the watch began to spin backward rapidly when the men brought it near the electronic sensors of their equipment. The authorities sealed the entrance to the pull-off with a thick layer of reinforced concrete to prevent any further trespassing or investigation by the public. Silas often thinks about the quiet technician and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for anyone who found the bunker. The logbook serves as a haunting reminder that some secrets are buried beneath the highway for a very specific and dark reason. He no longer works on mountain infrastructure projects because the low humming sound still echoes in his ears whenever he is alone at night. The pull-off remains empty and forgotten by the thousands of drivers who pass over the secret every single day. Every time Silas drives past that specific mile marker on the highway, he remembers the frantic handwriting of the lost government technician named Elias. He kept a photocopy of the logbook in a secure file, but he rarely has the courage to look at the final ink smear. The researcher, Marcus Reed, resigned from his position shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the gold watch or the tunnels. Local legends continue to grow about the unmarked pull-off and the green lights that still appear in the woods during the summer. Silas knows that the truth is buried deep in the limestone bedrock where the vibrations never truly stopped moving through the earth. What happened inside this winter motel still haunts police. The discovery of a frozen guest log beneath the floorboards of a demolished building changed the history of a small town. A construction worker found the leather book while clearing debris from a winter motel that had been closed for decades. The pages were damp, but the ink remained legible enough to reveal a series of names that never officially checked out. It contained a final entry from a traveler who seemed to document a very strange event before vanishing into the night. Silas Vance was a 45-year-old insurance investigator who spent his days traveling between the quiet and snowy towns. He arrived at the motel early on a Tuesday evening with the simple goal of resting before his morning meeting. The weather was unusually cold for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his paperwork in the warm room. He carried a heavy briefcase and a small portable radio to keep him company during the long and silent winter night. The air was dry, and the building felt heavy with the scent of old carpet and stale smoke that lingered. As Silas parked his car in front of room 12, he noticed a series of strange markings on the doorframe. He followed the grain of the wood with his fingers until he felt a deep vibration coming from the door. The investigator stepped inside the room and noticed that the furniture was arranged in a pattern that made no sense. He moved toward the desk and found a small handwritten note tucked under the base of the plastic bedside lamp. The note was dated August 10, 1972, and it warned the reader not to turn off the lights. He sat on the bed, and the internal silence of the room was broken by a soft humming from the walls. A thick layer of frost began to form on the window, even though the heater was running at full power. Silas reached for his radio to find a music station, but only a rhythmic clicking came through the small speaker. He found a ledger in the drawer and noticed that the last guest had written about a shadow in corner. The handwriting was jagged and suggested that the person was feeling a sudden sense of physical dread or deep fear. According to local archives, the area where the motel stood had been the site of several missing person cases before. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple guests reported seeing figures that stood perfectly still in the parking lot. Search teams arrived at the property 4 days after Silas was reported missing, but found no signs of any struggle. They found his car parked in the exact same spot, but the interior was filled with a fine white sand. Silas left his briefcase on the bed, and it was the only piece of property that had a note. The investigator had decided to keep a log of the sounds he heard through the thin walls of the unit. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded time staring at the door while the clicking sound grew louder. Silas felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped toward the bathroom to investigate a bright light under the door. He walked toward the glowing crack and disappeared from the main room as the humming reached a very high pitch. The town was quiet when the developers finally found the hidden ledger during the demolition process many long years later. The authorities eventually found a working player and listened to the final 30 minutes of the tape Silas had made. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the snow. The figure in the room moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of a human being. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn the next guest about the light. The recording described how a large shadow would move across the ceiling, even when the lamp was turned toward wall. Witness statements from 1972 mention similar shadows being seen by a group of travelers in the same sector. Silas Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his head as the clicking sound moved closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the room that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the mirror to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the exterior bricks of motel. Silas stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a mechanism. The investigator whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the outdoor sign. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the power to fail so the room would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the windows up to the roof with a very terrifying mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Silas Vance had originally concluded that he likely walked into the snow and lost. However, the details in the ledger suggested that the investigator was being actively watched by something that understood his routine. The sheriff paused the tape and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the recording stopped at exactly midnight. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the tape matched the rhythm of breathing. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the wooden frame of the door in the room. The final few seconds of the audio contained a frantic description of the room being filled with a blue light. Silas shouted that the humming sound was vibrating his teeth and making his ears bleed from the sheer physical pressure. He mentioned that he was going to try and hide the ledger so that someone would eventually find the truth. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the radio being crushed shut. Silence filled the room of the station as the tape stopped without any more images of the desert or... The sheriff contacted the state archives the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the motel site. A technician named Marcus Reed examined the ledger and confirmed that the ink matched the supplies used in '72. They returned to the site of the ruins together to look for the briefcase Silas mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the foundation that contained a series of sketches and a watch. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the motel roof. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of room 12 with glowing patterns etched into its gray skin. Marcus noted that the silver watch had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light. They realized that Silas Vance had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that was very ancient. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the ledger remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Silas Vance often thinks about the quiet investigator and the warning he tried to leave behind. The book serves as a haunting reminder that the winter holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by the living. He no longer explores the old roadside buildings because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his. The site remains empty and avoided by locals, but the ledger still holds the final warning of 1970. Every time Marcus drives past the empty lot, he remembers the frantic handwriting of the lost man on the page. He kept a copy of the report in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to read. The researcher, Marcus Reed, moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver watch again. Local legends continue to grow about the motel room and the lights that still appear over the snow floor. Silas knew that the truth was recorded on that small ledger hidden under the boards of the old room. Today, the highway is monitored by new systems that do not require a man to stop at a motel today. The lot is covered with winter snow, and the state has removed the old signs from the high desert sector. Silas Vance spends his time working in the city where the lights keep the shadows away from the windows. He still wonders if the clicking sound he heard on the tape was a message or just the sound. The winter wind continues to blow snow against the ruins, while the memory of the investigator fades into local history. The road goes on forever, but some travelers never reach the end of the line because of the motel lights. Keep your eyes on the road and do not look too long into the shadows of the high winter night. The truth is there, but it is hidden in the static and the clicking of the old magnetic tapes recorded. Silas Vance knows this, and that is why his voice stays in the ledger where the words never truly fade. The snow is waiting for the next traveler to pull over and listen to the humming in the air. The archived records of the local police department show that the original investigators were deeply unsettled by the evidence found. Many of them resigned within a year of the search and refused to speak about the details of Room 12. They reportedly felt a lingering coldness that no amount of heating could fix even in the middle of the summer. The case of Silas Vance remains one of the most chilling, unexplained mysteries in the history of the Mountain Pass. His voice on the tape continues to remind us that some winter nights are far longer than the calendar says. This security footage was reviewed years later. The grainy black and white pixels of an old security tape often hide more secrets than they reveal to the naked eye. Digital archives from the mid-1990s show that most regional storage facilities only kept footage for 30 days before recording over it. Silas Vance was 62 years old and worked as a consultant for a private archival firm specializing in cold cases. He had spent his entire career looking for the small details that other investigators missed during the initial chaos of a crime. Silas arrived at the climate-controlled warehouse in the autumn of 2024 to review a box of labeled tapes. His goal for the week was to digitize the final records of a defunct shipping company located in a remote valley. The air inside the vault was dry and smelled of old magnetic tape and the faint scent of ozone from the machines. The first strange clip appeared on a tape labeled 17 January 1988 at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning. It showed the perimeter fence of a loading dock during the height of a historic blizzard that had paralyzed the entire region. Silas watched as a man in a thick jacket walked slowly past the camera while carrying a long metallic surveyor rod. The man did not look at the lens, but he moved with a strange mechanical rhythm that seemed to ignore the wind. Silas paused the frame and tried to sharpen the image, but the snow was too thick to see a face clearly. He logged the timestamp and moved to the next reel, which covered a different camera angle on the opposite side. An hour of footage went by before the man appeared again on a camera located 3 miles away at a substation. This witness footage was captured only 10 minutes after the first sighting, which made the distance traveled physically impossible for anyone. Silas checked the map of the facility and realized the terrain between the two cameras was a steep and icy ravine. It would take a team of professional climbers hours to traverse that gap, even in the best possible summer weather conditions. The figure in the red jacket stood perfectly still in front of the high-voltage transformers for exactly 60 seconds total. He appeared to be taking measurements of the air itself, while the transformers sparked and glowed with a strange blue light. The investigator began to feel a sense of heavy dread as he realized the figure was not a standard trespasser or thief. He decided to cross-reference the footage with the dispatch logs he had discovered in a separate file from that era. Silas found a report from a dispatcher named Vance, who had noted a similar pattern of sightings during that same storm. The logs mentioned a man in a red jacket appearing at various points along the regional power grid in a straight line. Silas felt a chill as he realized the footage he was watching provided the visual evidence for these legendary ghost calls. He reached for a notepad and began to map out the coordinates of every camera that had captured the strange figure. A third clip showed the man standing on the roof of the main warehouse, looking out toward the dark mountain range. The camera was mounted 20 feet high, and there was no ladder or staircase that led to that specific vantage point. The figure held the surveyor rod high above his head as if he were trying to catch a signal from the sky. A massive flash of lightning illuminated the entire frame for a fraction of a second, and the man simply vanished into air. When the light faded, the roof was empty, and the only thing moving was the snow blowing across the flat surface. Silas replayed the segment 10 times, but he could not find any evidence of a jump or a hidden door. Silas started comparing the visual data with the original surveyor blueprints for the valley that were drawn in 1972. He used a digital overlay to match the positions of the man with the planned locations for the utility tower foundations. The points on the video matched the blueprints with a margin of error of less than 1 single inch of space. This line did not follow the actual towers that were built, but followed the original path that was later abandoned. Silas felt his hands shake as he realized the figure was following a ghost map of a project that never existed. He realized the man was Elias, who was the surveyor who had disappeared during the Great Blizzard of 1972. He reached out to a contact at the State University who specialized in electromagnetic anomalies and the recording of historical events. The professor listened to the description of the blue sparks and the surveyor rod, and he stayed silent for a long time. The academic finally suggested that the heavy snow and the high voltage lines might have created a natural recording of the past. He explained that certain materials can act as a permanent storage medium for human energy under the right atmospheric pressure conditions. Silas looked back at the screen and saw the man in the red jacket tapping on a window in the background. The tapping was silent on the tape, but Silas could almost hear the rhythmic sound echoing through the empty warehouse vault. The final reel of the collection showed the interior of the dispatch office during the transition of the morning shift change. Silas saw a younger version of himself sitting at the console while staring intensely at a paper map on the desk. In the reflection of the glass window behind the young Silas, he could see the man in the red jacket standing. The figure was not inside the room, but appeared to be standing in the reflection as if he were watching. Silas froze in the frame and realized the surveyor was looking directly at the map and pointing to the final substation. This footage had never been reviewed by anyone because the shipping company had gone bankrupt shortly after the storm of '88. Silas realized the figure was not a ghost in the traditional sense, but was a loop of time caught in wire. He received a final notification from the digitization software that the last tape had been successfully processed and stored in cloud. A technician near the end of the warehouse reported a strange humming sound coming from the old tape player in the corner. She said the machine was unplugged, but the reels were spinning at a high rate of speed while emitting blue light. Silas told her to leave the room immediately, and he locked the door to the vault with a heavy iron key. He looked at the monitors one last time and saw the red jacket standing in the middle of the warehouse aisle. The archival firm finished the project, but they decided to redact the specific timestamps of the man in the red jacket. They found a vintage surveyor rod hidden behind a false wall in the basement during the final sweep of the building. There was no explanation for how it got there or why the metal felt warm to the touch in winter. Silas kept a single screenshot of the reflection in his wallet as a reminder of the man who stayed behind. He never returned to the valley, and he stopped working as a cold case consultant shortly after the project ended. The tapes were destroyed in a controlled fire to prevent the loop from spreading to other modern digital recording systems. The mystery of the 1972 surveyor remains an unsolved file in the dusty cabinets of the local sheriff office. Experts say that the footage was likely a double exposure caused by the age of the magnetic tape and the heat. Silas knew the difference between a technical error and a man trying to find his way back to the main road. He lived the rest of his life in a house with no mirrors and no windows that faced the north side. The memory of the red pixels remained as a factual record of a night when the past became the present. The blizzard eventually ends, but the patterns we leave behind in the static never truly fade away from the world. A dispatcher noticed an odd pattern during the blizzard. The winter of 1988 brought a storm that locals still talk about during every single heavy snow alert. Records from the county dispatch office show that emergency calls tripled within the first 4 hours of the whiteout conditions. Silas Vance was 42 years old and worked as a senior dispatcher for the rural Mountain Valley Emergency Services. He had spent 12 years answering phones, but nothing prepared him for the chaos of that specific Tuesday in January. Silas arrived at the station before dawn, while the first flakes were just beginning to cover the dark asphalt roads. His goal for the shift was simple, since he just wanted to keep the radio channels clear for the plows. The wind picked up around 10 o'clock, and visibility dropped to near zero across the entire northern half of the valley. The first strange call came through at noon from a woman who reported a stalled sedan on a back road. She told Silas that she saw a man in a red jacket walking away from the car toward the woods. Silas logged the location and sent a deputy, but the officer found the car was empty and completely locked up. The deputy reported that there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle despite what the witness had just claimed. Silas assumed the snow had simply filled the tracks in quickly because the wind was gusting at 40 miles an hour. An hour later, another call arrived from a different part of the county regarding a man in a red jacket. This witness was an elderly farmer named Arthur, who claimed he saw someone standing in the middle of his field. Arthur said the figure was not moving at all despite the freezing temperatures and the blinding sheets of heavy snow. Silas checked the map and realized this farm was nearly 15 miles away from the first sighting of the sedan. It was impossible for someone to travel that distance on foot through a blizzard in such a short amount of time. The dispatcher began to feel a sense of unease as he looked at the blinking lights on his console screen. He decided to pull up the digital logs from the previous winter storms to see if this pattern had appeared. Dispatchers often share stories about ghost calls or strange sightings during heavy weather, but Silas usually ignored that kind of talk. He noticed a note in the archives from 1983 that mentioned a red jacket near a frozen creek bed. The similarities were enough to make him sit up straight and reach for his cold cup of black morning coffee. A third call interrupted his thoughts when a local gas station attendant reported a silent person standing by the pumps. The attendant described the individual as wearing a bright red coat that looked far too thin for the sub-zero weather. Silas asked the caller to approach the person, but the attendant refused because the stranger was behaving in a way. The person supposedly turned toward the shop window and just stared with an expression that the caller described as empty. When the deputy arrived 5 minutes later, the parking lot was empty and there were no signs of any visitors. Silas started plotting these points on a paper map of the valley to see if there was a physical connection. He used a red pen to mark the sedan, the farm, and the gas station while checking the exact times. The points formed a perfect straight line that cut across the most dangerous and uninhabited parts of the rugged mountain. This line did not follow any existing roads or hiking trails, which made the speed of the sightings even more. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows of the old dispatch center building office. He reached out to a retired dispatcher named Vance who had worked in the valley for over 35 years. Vance listened to the description of the red jacket and stayed silent on the other end of the phone line. The older man finally whispered that Silas should look at the logs from the Great Blizzard of 1972. Silas searched the basement archives and found a dusty folder containing handwritten notes from a very long night in December. He found a report about a missing surveyor who vanished while wearing a distinctive red parka during a record storm. The surveyor was named Elias, and he had been tasked with marking the boundary for a new high-voltage line. According to the old dispatch logs, Elias had sent a final radio transmission about getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Search teams looked for him for 3 weeks, but they never found a single trace of his gear or body. The line Silas had drawn on his map matched the exact path of the proposed power lines from that era. Every sighting from this afternoon was located at a spot where a massive steel utility tower currently stood in silence. Silas realized the figure was not walking between the locations, but was appearing at specific points along the electrical grid. He received one final call as the sun began to set behind the thick gray clouds of the dying storm. A homeowner near the end of the valley reported a man in a red jacket standing on her back porch. She said he was tapping on the glass and holding up a surveyor rod as if he were taking measurements. Silas told her to stay away from the windows and dispatched the nearest unit with a sense of urgent dread. The deputy reached the house in record time but found only a pile of snow leaning against the wooden door. There were no boots prints on the porch, and the homeowner was hiding in her bathroom with a loaded shotgun. Silas looked at his map one last time and saw the final point ended at the local main power substation. He called the utility company to warn them, but the technician said the gates were locked and the alarms silent. The storm finally broke around midnight, and the wind died down to a soft whistle through the frozen pine trees. Maintenance crews went out the following morning to clear the ice from the heavy lines near the primary mountain substation. They found a vintage surveyor rod leaning against the fence and a scrap of red fabric caught in the wire. There was no body found in the drifts, and no evidence that anyone had climbed over the high-security fence. Silas kept the scrap of fabric in his desk drawer as a reminder of the pattern he found that day. He never spoke about the red jacket again, but he always watched the monitors closely whenever the snow started falling. The valley remained quiet for the rest of the winter, and the strange calls did not return to the station. Experts say that sensory deprivation during blizzards can cause groups of people to imagine similar things out of thin air. Silas knew the difference between a tired mind and a factual log of events recorded in real time on paper. He retired 3 years later and moved to a coastal town where it never snows and the sun always shines. The records of 1988 remain in the basement for the next person who might notice the strange pattern. The county museum eventually displayed a small exhibit about the surveyor who disappeared so many long decades ago in the cold. Visitors often stop to read the official reports from that night, and they wonder about the man in the red coat. Some believe that the energy from the high voltage lines acted as a conduit for a soul lost in time. Others think that the extreme weather simply bends reality in ways that the human mind cannot ever fully understand or explain. The dispatch office still uses the same map system, but the younger workers do not know about the red ink. Silas spent his final days sitting on a porch by the ocean while reading books about geography and local mountain history. He often thought about the surveyor Elias and hoped the man finally found the boundaries he was looking for that night. The red fabric in his drawer eventually faded to a dull pink, but the memory of the tapping glass remained. He knew that some mysteries are not meant to be solved by police officers or by professional search and rescue teams. The blizzard of 1988 remains a legend that grows larger every time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The station logs were digitized in the year 2010, but some of the original handwritten notes were lost during the process. Silas had made sure to photocopy the most important pages before he left the valley for the very last time ever. He sent those copies to a historical society so that the truth of the pattern would not be forgotten by history. The surveyor rod found at the substation remains in a glass case as a silent witness to a very strange afternoon. No one has seen the man in the red jacket since the power grid was upgraded in the early 90s. The wind still howls through the mountain passes, and the snow still buries the small towns under feet of frozen white powder. Every dispatcher who sits at that desk now hears the faint static on the radio during the height of a storm. They look at the screens and they watch for any calls about a man walking alone where no man should be. The legacy of the red jacket is a part of the valley now, and it will be for a long time. Silas Vance died peacefully, knowing that he had documented the impossible with the steady hand of a true professional worker. Why this bridge is monitored every winter. The massive suspension bridge spanning the narrow canyon of the Iron River remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the northern range for over 60 years. A single automated structural sensor sat perched atop a weathered steel girder near the remote boundary of the central support tower. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the dangerous buildup of ice and snow on the suspension cables. Local maintenance officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant tremor or a major blizzard was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in December of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary to any casual observer. Caleb Vance was a 42-year-old structural technician who worked for the Regional Bridge Authority during that busy year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Caleb enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of reinforced steel. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated canyon crossing. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir trees. Caleb reached the base of the tower and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy ice storm. Caleb decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software of the camera. He wanted to make sure the optical sensor had not been damaged by the freezing rain or the high winds. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still properly focused. He saw the familiar gray cables and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at high speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around it. A dark maintenance van was parked on the narrow shoulder of the bridge just past the edge of the pedestrian walkway. The van had its hazard lights on, and the rear cargo door was left standing wide open toward the deep canyon below. It was an odd place to stop because the bridge was cleared of all work crews during the winter months. Caleb felt a slight chill because that section of the river crossing was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service coverage. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if a worker was standing near the vehicle for help. The dark van was still there, but the open door was now closed and a dark figure stood near the edge. The figure appeared to be reaching over the metal railing, and they were pulling something heavy out from the deep shadows. Caleb zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty industrial trunk. The person in the photo was wearing a heavy insulated parka that obscured their identity from the camera lens. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes total. The third photo showed the dark van pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the slush. Caleb looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the snow was still flattened near the railing. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the safety barrier and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The air was freezing, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the massive steel cables. The ground was slick from the recent ice, and he noticed deep grooves in the frost where something heavy had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 20 feet until he reached a small maintenance access hatch hidden behind a thicket of support beams. Caleb found the industrial trunk tucked under a pile of damp tarpaulins and heavy coils of wire that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial duct tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Caleb immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper law enforcement authorities present at the scene. He used his satellite radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item on the bridge. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Caleb to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the make and the model of the van. The officers noted that the vehicle did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the captured frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a quiet break-in that left no physical evidence. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the missing items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them on the bridge until the search died down. The police realized the driver must have returned to the crossing to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the bridge camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the dark van. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the canyon. They found the vehicle hidden in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and old weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret overseas purchase. One of the men was a former bridge inspector who knew exactly how to avoid the primary security monitoring systems. He did not realize that the remote structural camera was set to trigger every minute, regardless of any motion detection. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. The archives of the Bridge Authority had captured the one moment he thought was completely private. Caleb returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The Iron River Bridge was now safe from the looters, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely spans. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a very watchful eye. The automated camera still stands on its steel girder and records the passage of time one frame at a time. It captures the fog and the ice and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep canyon. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Caleb knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look for it. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might have caught. The bridge remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. The federal investigation into the museum theft revealed that the suspects had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the border. This operation would have stripped the region of its cultural history and compromised the integrity of the local museum archives. The recovery of the original artifacts ensured that several ongoing historical research projects could be settled with accurate evidence. Caleb received a formal commendation from the state governor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire mountain community. He often shares the story of the bridge camera with new technicians as a lesson in professional diligence. The structural logs are now fully digitized, but the physical history remains protected by the sensors and the heavy steel beams. The quiet bridge stands over the river and continues to serve the travelers as it has for many decades. Visitors admire the architecture and the views of the canyon without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the walkway. The story of the structural sensor and the industrial trunk has become a local legend among the mountain residents. Most people walk past the steel tower without realizing its significance in the history of the regional highway. For Caleb, the sound of the wind against the cables will always be a reminder of the hidden truths in the cold. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The truth about what happened on that Tuesday in December remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and police files. The people of the mountain valley continue their lives while the mystery of the bridge camera hangs over the canyon. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Caleb continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The The silence of the bridge is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The story of the Iron River is written in the steel and preserved in the digital logs. The Bridge Authority implemented new security protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Caleb is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all travelers. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Caleb knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look. The mystery of the canyon bridge is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. Technicians now take a little more time to review the archives before they clear out the temporary storage on site. They look for the parked vans and the open doors and the figures moving through the shadows in the dark. The mountains keep many secrets, but they are becoming harder to hide from the ever-watchful digital eyes of the sensors. Caleb takes a final look at his laptop screen before he packs up his gear and heads back to the city. Everything is as it should be, and the system is functioning perfectly once again for the next 30 days of winter. He starts his truck and begins the long descent toward the valley while the mountain peaks fade in the mirror. The bridge is a lonely path through the wilderness, but it is no longer a place of hidden crimes and secrets. Every minute, a small click echoes from the top of the steel tower as a new image is captured. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The story of the bridge is over, but the watch over the canyon will never truly end. In this new story, archived winter summaries across several mountain districts mention a cluster of December disappearances that occurred in remote forest corridors during severe cold snaps. None of the cases shared confirmed connections, yet the patterns unsettled investigators because each incident involved travelers who vanished within narrow windows of time and distance. Locals across distant counties traded similar warnings about isolated routes that turned unpredictable once deep winter settled over the landscape. Maeve Corbin, a 35-year-old contract cartographer, drove into one of those regions during early December while updating wildfire access maps before heavy storms closed the mountain roads. Her assignment required photographing trail markers, verifying creek crossings, and checking outdated maintenance routes. She expected a calm day because forecasts predicted only light snow with no major wind. She carried her camera bag, a roll of updated charts, and a small thermos she rarely traveled without. The forest road twisted between steep ridges where the sky looked pale and flat. Patches of ice crept across the asphalt, which forced her to reduce speed. She passed a faded sign warning that plows rarely reached beyond the next junction. A second sign hung loosely along a bent post announcing road closures from mid-month onward. She knew officials planned to block the route soon, but she needed one final survey before seasonal shutdown. After an hour, she reached a narrow turnout where a wooden information board leaned forward as if pushed by years of storms. She stepped out to photograph the area and noticed several footprints leading toward a slope behind the turnout. The prints appeared fresh, which surprised her because no vehicles had passed during her entire drive. She followed the tracks for several yards before they disappeared into a cluster of spruce where snow thickened unexpectedly. Maeve returned to her truck just as wind brushed across the ridge. She climbed back in, warmed her hands near the heater, and drove deeper along the route until she reached a rusted trail gate chained open for winter access. Beyond it, the trees grew denser while the road narrowed. She stopped again when she spotted a small backpack lying upright near a drainage ditch. The sight made her uneasy because the pack looked recently dropped. She examined the backpack carefully. Inside, she found a half-frozen water bottle, an outdated trail map, and a name tag belonging to someone who reportedly passed through the region earlier that week. Local bulletins had mentioned a hiker who turned back during a sudden snow squall, then never returned to town. The match between the name and the story sent a chill through her despite the insulated gloves she wore. She wrote the coordinates in her notebook, then scanned the surrounding woods. Snow fell lightly, which muted the forest until everything felt distant. Wind carried faint creaks from trees shifting under frost. She called out, "Anyone here?" even knowing the chances of hearing a reply were low. Her voice vanished into the branches almost instantly. As she prepared to leave the area, she noticed a strip of reflective tape fixed high on a pine trunk. The tape looked newer than the map in the backpack, which puzzled her because crews rarely mark trees during winter. She photographed the tape, then moved closer to investigate. Behind the trunk, she found a narrow footpath nearly hidden under fresh snow. The path sloped downward toward a shallow ravine. Maeve followed it only briefly because she wanted to finish her official survey before exploring more. She drove another mile until the road opened into a broad meadow where the wind carried powder across the ground in thin streams. The sky darkened earlier than expected, which hinted at an incoming front. She stopped near an old ranger's shed, leaning crookedly against a boulder. The door hung half open as if someone entered recently. Inside, she discovered a battered notebook full of field notes from a ranger patrol several years earlier. The writer described multiple strange findings across the region, including abandoned campsites, missing equipment caches, and faint tracks that vanished mid-trail. One entry mentioned hearing rhythmic knocks in a valley that appeared empty at the time. Another referred to sudden temperature drops in sheltered areas that normally stayed warm due to thick tree coverage. A gust of wind pushed snow into the shed, which made her step outside. She noticed a distant flash of movement between the tree line and the meadow. It looked like someone crossing the clearing quickly. She called out again, but received no answer. She recorded the direction in her notes because the movement matched earlier reports about people seen shortly before storms swept through. She returned to her truck and continued along the route until she reached a steep descent toward a river crossing. The radio crackled with faint static as she drove into the low ground. The river froze early this year, which formed jagged ridges of ice near the bank. She parked near the bridge, which creaked under layers of frost. The scene felt isolated enough to raise her vigilance. She scanned the area and saw a small pile of orange fabric caught in a brush cluster. She approached and found a torn piece of a high-visibility jacket. The fabric pattern matched gear often used by volunteer search teams. She collected the fragment, sealed it in a small evidence pouch, and wrote the discovery in her notebook. A trail of shallow footprints stretched from the fabric toward the riverbank, then curved sharply uphill toward dense vegetation. Maeve followed the trail, which led to an open section of forest where trees grew in uneven clusters. The air felt colder here, even though the wind paused briefly. She heard a faint, repetitive sound that resembled metal shifting. The pattern echoed irregularly, which made her wonder if it came from old equipment hidden somewhere beneath the snow. She swept her flashlight across the branches and noticed more reflective tape placed higher than typical trail markers. She recorded the placements, which formed a rough arc around the clearing. The arrangement looked intentional rather than random. She moved farther into the trees and found a narrow ravine where the snowpack appeared disturbed. Several sets of tracks converged into the ravine, though none continued beyond it. It looked as if multiple individuals descended the ravine, yet never climbed out. She crouched to examine the slope and noticed faint indentations almost hidden beneath the surface. They resembled pressure marks left by equipment pulled along the ground. She brushed away a patch of snow and revealed a rusted metal rung embedded into the soil. The rung looked like part of an old ascent ladder used during past forestry projects. She tugged on it lightly and felt a hollow space beneath. Her pulse quickened as she realized a buried structure might exist under the ravine. Old industrial tunnels or storm shelters sometimes collapsed, then filled with soil and ice. She considered climbing down for a clearer look, but the ground felt unstable. A deep vibration traveled through the slope, which convinced her to back away. The vibration lasted several seconds, then faded like a distant machine shutting down. She returned to her truck and drove toward a higher junction where she could regain radio contact. However, the snow thickened into a white curtain, which limited visibility to a few yards. The approaching storm arrived earlier than predicted, which forced her to stop near a rock outcrop. She checked her maps and found an old maintenance spur branching off the main route. She considered waiting the storm out inside her truck, but the wind intensified until the vehicle rocked gently. She turned onto the spur, hoping to reach a sheltered runoff area. Halfway up the incline, she saw a flickering light near a line of trees. The light pulsed slowly as if signaling through heavy snowfall. She thought it might be a lost hiker or a stranded motorist, so she parked and stepped out with her flashlight raised high. She moved closer and saw the light belonged to a small lantern hanging from a branch. The lantern's flame flickered erratically despite the wind. Beneath it, a message scratched into bark read, "Shelter Line West, Trail 2." She took a picture of the message because the direction did not match any current maps. Before she could investigate further, she heard another vibration behind her. This time, the sound clearly resembled metal scraping across stone. She turned to see a dark outline shift along the ridge, though the storm blurred the details. The shape moved slowly, then vanished behind a curtain of snow. She backed toward her truck, but stopped when she noticed another set of footprints near the lantern. The steps looked fresher than those near the ravine, which meant someone recently walked this route during the worsening storm. Maeve followed the footprints along the spur, which led her to an exposed slope overlooking a deep bowl-shaped corridor. The wind calmed momentarily, which gave her a clear view of the valley floor. She saw multiple patterns carved into the snow, which resembled rows of long trenches or paths created by dragging equipment. At the far end of the bowl, a faint orange glow flickered near the base of a cliff. She zoomed in with her camera and captured several photos. The glow pulsed in a steady sequence, which reminded her of security beacons or signal flares. She lowered the camera as another vibration traveled through the ground. Snow along the slope shifted slightly, which convinced her to retreat before a slide occurred. She drove back toward the main route and reached a narrow ridge where the wind finally eased enough for her to regain partial radio contact. She relayed her findings to a dispatch operator who promised to send search teams when conditions improved. She continued toward the junction when she saw a lone figure standing near a marker post. She slowed her vehicle and opened the window to call out, but the figure turned and walked toward a thicket without responding. She parked and followed on foot with her flashlight directed forward. The figure disappeared behind clusters of fir trees which bent under the weight of snow. She searched the area for several minutes until she found a scrap of fabric caught on a branch. The material matched the torn jacket found near the river, which meant she followed the same person or someone wearing similar gear. She marked the area on her map and returned to her truck as the storm thickened again. By the time she reached town, she felt exhausted from navigating through swirling ice and limited visibility. She handed her notes and photographs to local authorities who launched a coordinated search involving multiple teams. Over the next days, crews uncovered signs of old subterranean structures near the ravine and discovered collapsed ventilation shafts hidden under decades of soil. They found fragments of cold-weather clothing near one shaft, which suggested at least one traveler entered the area recently. Searchers also found pieces of rusted metal aligned in patterns that matched the long trenches Maeve captured in her photos. Engineers believed the structures belonged to a decades-old survey project abandoned after repeated cave-ins and safety violations. Thick snowfall and unstable terrain hid the remains until small shifts exposed parts during recent storms. Despite extensive searches, none of the recent missing individuals were recovered. Their tracks led toward the ravine, then vanished. Officials installed warning signs along the entire route and restricted access to the bowl-shaped corridor where the vibrations continued intermittently throughout the season. Acoustic equipment detected low-frequency pulses beneath the ground, though investigators could not confirm their source. Maeve continued her mapping work for the region but avoided the specific corridor after her report. She believed the December disappearances connected to the unstable subsurface network and shifting snow patterns that revealed and concealed pathways unpredictably. She often thought about the lantern hanging from the tree and the carved message pointing toward a shelter line no longer marked on any map. Locals still warn travelers each December about remote areas with unexplained vibrations and old structures hidden under winter snow. They recount stories about lights flickering near forgotten corridors and figures moving between trees just before storms intensify. Each tale differs slightly, yet the core remains the same. Some December nights, the forest feels alive with echoes of routes built long before current maps existed. And sometimes footsteps lead into valleys where wind and snow erase each trace within minutes, leaving only cold silence across remote America. This isolated church has a long history. The historic stone chapel, located on the high ridge of the Northern Valley, remained a silent witness to the local history. A heavy oak door stood in the darkest corner of the eastern transept to protect the original property deeds and maps. This facility was a critical link for the Parish Heritage Board because it provided the only physical evidence for the building. For 70 years, the archive operated without a single major incident until a Friday in November of 2022. On that day, the building recorded a sequence of structural shifts that defied every known engineering model used by the office. Lyle Vance was a 46-year-old historical preservation officer who worked for the regional government during that busy year. His primary job involved reviewing the weekly building reports to ensure the foundations remained stable against the shifting mountain groundwater. Lyle enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the hidden corners of the town buildings. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of ancient stone. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific vibration sensor was experiencing a strange recurring calibration error. The descent took nearly 10 minutes as the air grew colder and the dim lights flickered over the damp walls. Lyle reached the end of the hall and connected his diagnostic tablet to the monitoring port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the data logs were almost full of movement alerts that should have been ignored by the software. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of seismic readings taken during a recent light rain. Lyle decided to download the final batch of sensor data before he cleared the memory and reset the internal hardware. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the event logs to ensure the equipment was anchored. He saw the familiar baseline readings and the small spikes caused by the passing of heavy trucks on the road. One log from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the pressure signature looked different from the data around it. A massive weight had been applied to the internal side of the sealed wall just past the edge of the frame. The sensor recorded a steady push that lasted for exactly 5 minutes before the entire system went dark for a second. Lyle felt a slight chill because that section of the church was known for being a completely dead zone for signals. He clicked on the next file in the sequence to see if the building had shifted again during the night shift. The pressure was still there, but the sensor reading was now pulsing and a low-frequency hum stood near the frequency. The force appeared to be originating from deep beneath the floor, and it was pulling something heavy out from the dark. Lyle zoomed in on the digital waves until he could see the silhouette of a large and repeating vibration. He checked the timestamps and realized that the event had been at that specific location for less than 10 minutes total. The third log showed the pressure dropping back to 0 and leaving nothing but a flat line in the file. Lyle looked toward the actual wall in the corner and saw that the mortar seal was still perfectly intact today. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished now. The air was stagnant, and the only sound was the hum of the ventilation fans echoing through the empty corridor. The floor was dry from the recent summer heat, and he noticed thin cracks in the stone where the wall met. He followed the line for about 5 feet until he reached a small gap hidden behind a stack of metal shelves. Lyle found a heavy iron latch tucked under a layer of thick dust and cobwebs that looked intentionally placed long ago. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy bolt was sealed with industrial wax. A faint smell of sulfur hung in the heavy air, and Lyle immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He used his portable radio to contact the main office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious architectural anomaly today. Within an hour, 2 structural engineers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with bright orange plastic tape. They asked Lyle to show them the sensor logs on his tablet so they could identify the source of force. The engineers noted that the hidden hallway did not have a registered blueprint in any of the municipal archive books here. They carefully scraped the wax on the latch and discovered several rusted ventilation pipes from a forgotten early 20th century. The local museum had reported a missing set of original town founding documents 3 months earlier, but the police had nothing. These papers were extremely valuable, and a former clerk had likely hidden them in the wall until the investigation closed now. The engineers realized the thief must have used the old vault room to hide the stolen property behind the wall. They analyzed the sensor data from other units along the foundation to track the path of the subtle structural shifts. This lead eventually took them to a small residential house located 2 blocks over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more documents that had been taken during the same period earlier that same year. The suspect had been living there under a false name while he waited for a collector to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former janitor who knew exactly how to access the sub-basement without triggering alarms. He did not realize that the new vibration sensors were set to record every movement regardless of the weight or size. His simple mistake of leaning against the hidden latch had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. Lyle returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details today. Most people would have deleted the error logs without looking at the data because it was a routine maintenance job. The historical records were now safe from the thief, and the original deeds were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the municipal buildings and always looked a little closer at the logs from the basements. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The hidden latch still stands in its dark corner and records the passage of time 1 minute at a time now. It sits behind the metal shelves and the occasional staff member who travels through the silence of the lower levels. No one ever suspects that a simple sensor could be the most important witness to a crime in the building. Lyle knows that every data log tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look today. He walks the halls with a new perspective and watches the digital monitors for anything else the system catches. The federal investigation into the document theft revealed that the suspects had intended to sell the items on the market. This operation would have stripped the town of its legal history and compromised the property rights of many local families. The recovery of the original land survey maps ensured that several ongoing legal disputes could be settled with accurate evidence. Lyle received a formal commendation from the mayor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire Valley community. He often shares the story of the hidden hallway with new preservation officers as a lesson in professional diligence. The quiet church stands on the hill and continues to serve the families as it has for many generations now. Visitors admire the architecture and the stained glass windows without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the floor. The story of the vibration sensor and the iron latch has become a local legend among the town residents today. Most people walk past the oak door in the transept without realizing its significance in the history of the parish. For Lyle, the sound of the wind against the limestone will always be a reminder of the hidden truths. The truth about what happened on that Friday in October remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and files. The people of the Quiet Valley continue their lives while the mystery of the church hallway hangs over the town. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Lyle continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm today. The silence of the basement is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The archives of the town recorded the passage of time as the seasons changed from the heat of the summer. The limestone walls of the old chapel remained strong against the wind that blew across the high ridge of the mountain. Lyle often looks at the digital feed from the sensors on his tablet while he sits in his quiet office. He knows that the history of the town is safe as long as someone is willing to watch the data. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The structural engineers completed their final report on the hidden corridor and the forgotten vault room in the sub-basement. They found that the original construction had been modified several times during the early part of the 20th century. These changes were never added to the official maps of the town or the blueprints of the historic limestone chapel. This lack of information provided the perfect hiding place for someone who wanted to keep a secret in the dark. The discovery of the iron latch was a turning point in the investigation into the missing regional property deeds. The former janitor was arrested and charged with the theft of several state documents that were over 80 years old. He had been planning to move the items to a secondary location when the vibration sensor recorded his presence today. The evidence from the digital logs was a critical part of the case presented by the local district attorney. The community was relieved to know that the history of their homes and lands was once again secure in archives. Lyle continues to perform his duties with a sense of purpose that comes from knowing he made a difference. The story of the isolated church and its hidden history serves as a reminder of the value of the archives. It shows that even the most mundane data can hold the key to solving a mystery from the recent past. The machines that monitor our world are silent witnesses to the actions of the people who move through it. We may not always see the cameras or the sensors, but they are recording the truth 1 second at a time. For the residents of the valley, the stone chapel is more than just a place of quiet reflection now. The preservation of history requires the constant attention of people like Lyle Vance, who value the details of the world. He remains a dedicated officer who understands that the past is a foundation for the future of the quiet town. The record of the hidden hallway is a permanent part of the digital logs stored in the local government office. It will be there for the next generation of technicians to find when they perform their routine maintenance checks. The history of the church is written in the stone and preserved in the silent data of the sensors. This abandoned cabin drew quiet warnings. The dense forests of the northern border states are filled with small structures that have been reclaimed by the thick moss over time. Local history records from the early 1970s indicate that one specific property on the ridge was deliberately left off all official maps. Silas Vance was 58 years old and worked as a senior land surveyor for a private timber company in the valley. He had spent 30 years walking through the brush, but he always avoided the steep slope near the jagged limestone cliffs. Silas arrived at the base of the ridge during a rainy morning in October with a goal to mark the timberline. The air was heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and the distant sound of the rushing mountain river below. He pushed through a thick stand of cedar trees and found the cabin standing in a small and unnervingly quiet clearing. The first strange detail was that the cabin appeared to be built from timber that did not grow in this specific region. Silas saw that the logs were a dark and heavy species of wood that usually only exists in much higher altitudes. He checked his handheld GPS unit and found that the signal was bouncing wildly between different coordinates in a fast pattern. Silas moved toward the front door and noticed that the wood had been carved with hundreds of small and precise notches. The local sheriff had once told Silas that the old cabin was a place where people went when they wanted to vanish. This warning had seemed like a simple campfire story until Silas saw the heavy iron locks on the outside of the door. Silas assumed the locks were meant to keep animals out, but they were positioned to keep something from pushing the door open. An hour later, Silas found a rusted metal box buried under a pile of rotted firewood near the back porch steps. This box contained a stack of black and white photographs and a small diary wrapped in a piece of red fabric. The photos were dated from 1964 to 1972, and they showed the cabin at different times of day. Silas flipped through the images and realized that the forest around the cabin never changed or grew in the 8 years shown. It looked like the trees were frozen in a specific stage of autumn despite the passage of nearly a decade of seasons. Silas checked the names written on the back of the photos, but they were all listed as missing in the county. It was impossible to tell why these people had gathered at this cabin, or what they were waiting for in the woods. The surveyor began to feel a sense of heavy observation as he stood in the center of the silent forest clearing. He decided to open the diary to see if it contained any explanation for the strange notches on the exterior logs. Silas read the entries and found that the writer was a man who claimed the cabin was not always physically there. The man wrote that the structure would appear during the heavy fog and then vanish when the sun hit the high ridge. Silas felt a chill despite his heavy wool coat because the handwriting looked exactly like the notes from the old dispatcher files. His mentor had mentioned a surveyor named Elias, who disappeared on this ridge during a storm in 1972. Elias had been tasked with marking the same timberline that Silas was currently standing on during this rainy autumn. A third anomaly appeared when Silas looked through the dusty window and saw a table set for a very large meal. The plates were filled with food that looked fresh and steaming, even though the cabin had been abandoned for many years. Silas placed his hand on the glass and found that the window was vibrating with a low and steady electrical hum. One specific chair at the head of the table was pulled out as if someone had just stood up to leave. This chair faced a wall that was covered in a massive map of the stars that were not currently visible. Silas asked himself why a simple woodsman would need such a complex understanding of the movement of the celestial bodies. When Silas looked back at the forest, he saw a man in a red jacket standing near the cedar trees. Silas started connecting the dates in the diary with the records of the great blizzard that hit the valley years ago. He used a red pen to mark the nights when the local residents had reported seeing strange lights on the ridge. The lights occurred on the exact same nights that the missing persons had last been seen by their family and friends. This pattern suggested that the cabin was acting as a beacon or a doorway for something that moved in the dark. Silas felt the ground shake under his heavy boots, even though there were no active fault lines in this mountain range. He realized the cabin was not a shelter, but was a fixed point for a signal that was being broadcast. Silas reached out to a retired park ranger who had patrolled this sector back in the late 1960s. The ranger listened to the description of the red fabric, and he told Silas to leave the ridge immediately without looking back. The old man whispered that the cabin was built on a pocket of air that did not belong to this world. He claimed that the notches on the logs were a countdown that had been running for over 50 years of time. Silas looked back at the diary and realized the numbers were counting down to the exact date of the current afternoon. Every name listed in the county archives was actually a witness who had seen the cabin appearing through the thick gray fog. Silas found a page that described a man who would come to finish the survey and take the final measurements. The surveyor Elias was the last person to sign the diary before the entries stopped in the winter of 72. According to the final note, Elias had discovered that the cabin was the source of the magnetic interference in the area. Silas realized the man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was a projection of the lost surveyor himself. He received one final shock when he looked at his own compass and saw the needle spinning in a perfect circle. The figure in the red jacket began to walk toward the cabin door with a steady and very mechanical rhythm. Silas turned away and ran back toward the river as the fog began to swallow the entire ridge in white. He realized that the ordinary cabin was a trap for anyone who tried to map the secrets of the mountain. Silas packed his gear and decided to report that the ridge was too unstable for any timber harvesting or commercial activity. He called his supervisor to say that the coordinates were blocked by limestone deposits that interfered with the radio signal. The supervisor accepted the report without any further questions, as if he were relieved to finally close the folder forever. Silas drove away and watched the mountain peak disappear in the clouds as the first heavy rain began to fall. He kept the red fabric in his pocket as a reminder of the man who was still marking the lines. He never spoke about the cabin to the other surveyors or to the people who lived in the valley. The property was officially designated as a protected wilderness area, but the logs remained there in the deep and quiet. The mystery of the abandoned cabin remains a secret known only to those who have felt the vibration in the ground. Experts say that the mountain air can cause a person to lose their sense of direction and see strange things. Silas knew the difference between a natural fog and a structure that existed between the ticks of a mechanical clock. He lived the rest of his life watching the weather reports for any mention of the ridge and the fog. The forest holds its secrets in the deep roots, and the wind covers the sound of the tapping on wood. The quiet warnings were real, and the cabin is still waiting for the next person to find the path. Silas Vance died, knowing that some lines on a map are not meant to be crossed by any living man. The timber company eventually sold the rights to the land to a private conservation group that promised to keep it wild. They had seen the reports filed by Silas and decided that some areas were better left untouched by modern development. The cabin remains hidden by the fast-growing brush and the thick blankets of snow that fall every single winter. Hikers occasionally report a faint hum coming from the ridge, but they are usually warned to stay on the main trails. The local historical society keeps a small file on the surveyor Elias, but it is restricted to high-level researchers. Silas had left a map behind that showed exactly where the cabin was, but he had crossed it out. He knew that documenting the location was a danger to anyone who might feel tempted to solve the mystery. The air on the ridge stays colder than the surrounding forest, even during the peak of the summer heat in July. Animals avoid the clearing, and birds do not build nests in the branches of the cedar trees that surround the cabin. The surveyor rod that Silas found was never officially turned in to the authorities because he feared what they would do. He buried it in his own backyard under a foot of concrete where it could no longer send out a signal. The red jacket continues to be seen by those who are lost in the woods during the heavy autumn rains. They say the man helps them find their way back to the river before the fog takes the cabin away. It is a cycle that has no beginning and no end in the long history of the mountains. The records of the missing persons were never updated because no remains were ever found on the ridge or nearby. The families eventually moved away, but they always left a light on in case their loved ones finally came home. Silas had realized that the cabin was a place of waiting where time did not function like a straight line. He understood that the people in the photos were still sitting at that table in a different version of today. The stars on the wall map were a guide for a journey that was not meant to be taken on foot. The notches on the logs will eventually reach zero, and the cabin will become a permanent part of the ridge. Silas Vance died at the age of 84 with a smile on his face and a compass in his hand. The woods are deep and full of things that we were never meant to understand with our limited human logic. The warnings were quiet because the truth was too loud for the residents of the small valley to hear clearly. Every time a surveyor goes out to mark a new line, they feel the eyes of the mountain on them. They know that the past is always just a few steps behind them in the thick fog of the forest. The story of Silas and Elias is told in whispers during the long nights of the northern winter storms. It is a reminder that the world is much larger and stranger than any map could ever hope to show. The abandoned cabin stands in silence while the wind carries the sound of a surveyor marking the wooden logs. This final voicemail from a highway turnout still has no explanation. The discovery of a mobile phone at the edge of a steep embankment changed the direction of a major search. A local road worker found the device while clearing dry brush near a remote highway turnout in the late autumn season. The battery was long dead, but the internal storage remained intact and contained a single recording that baffled the local authorities. It was a 3-minute voicemail left on an answering machine that seemed to document a very strange and sudden disappearance. Lyle Vance was a 42-year-old long-haul trucker who had spent his career driving through the high desert. He arrived at the mountain pass early on a Tuesday night with the simple goal of resting before his final delivery. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Lyle expected to finish his route well before the sunrise. He carried a heavy thermos of coffee and a small notebook to record his mileage and fuel stops for the company. The highway was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of sagebrush and cold engine oil that night. As Lyle pulled his heavy silver truck into the paved turnout, he noticed a series of strange lights in the sky. He followed the flickering glow with his eyes until he reached the very edge of the gravel shoulder near the cliff. The dash cam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect a noise coming from the rear of the trailer. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the rocks near the base of peaks. He returned to the cab and checked his radio before realizing that the signal was dropping out for no clear reason. He sat in the driver's seat, and the internal microphone captured a strange humming sound that seemed to come from above. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind there. Lyle reached for his phone to call his wife and leave a quick message about the delay in his scheduled return. The voicemail began with him explaining that he saw a group of figures walking across the empty highway in the dark. His voice was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or a deep growing fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle stopped had been the site of several unexplained events since 1974. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that multiple drivers reported seeing shadows that moved without making any sound on the road. Search teams arrived at the turnout 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but they found no signs of struggle. They found his truck idling with the door wide open, but the keys were missing from the heavy metal ignition switch. Lyle left his phone on the dashboard, and it was the only piece of hardware that had a recorded file. The trucker had decided to keep the call active even when he realized that no one was picking up the phone. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the microphone picked up a rhythmic. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the truck one last time to investigate the bright glow. He walked toward the edge of the turnout and disappeared from the range of the cab lights as the clicking grew. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several long weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working player and watched the final 30 minutes of the video file with the volume up. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the mountain pass. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the walk of any human being. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn his wife about a sudden light. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the pavement even when the moon was hidden behind the clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of tourists in the same mountain sector. Lyle Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from starting his truck and leaving now. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the side mirrors to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the aluminum panels of the trailer. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a mechanism. The trucker whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high-beam lights. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the fuel to run out so the turnout would be in darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the cab with great mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Vance had originally concluded that he likely suffered a medical event and fell. However, the details on the phone suggested that the trucker was being actively followed by something that understood his equipment. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of man. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the frame of the heavy truck in the quiet night. The final few seconds of the voicemail contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the window from outside. Lyle